Hey, good to see you. Thanks for coming. Another episode of Wireframe, brought to you by Design Systems House. I'm your host, Donnie D'Amato, and I think that was a pretty good intro. Nothing went wrong so far. I hate having to call that out, but we're still in the midst of making sure that this is a great show. And thank you for joining me on this show. You should have a good one today. It is Monday. It's a new week. I had a busy weekend of doing things. In fact, actually, well, Saturday we ended up being potatoes in the house, but I was still very productive because I got a little bit of a motivation from speaking on Wireframe about my old project, Delta Zeus. So I've been working on Delta Zeus over the weekend and having ups and downs with it, unfortunately. I will say the front end is looking really great. It's doing exactly what I wanted to, more or less. But I think the back end has always been my problem, right? So actually yesterday on Sunday, in between some of the stuff that we were doing, we ended up, I ended up having a couple of hours of free time in between all that where I was effectively trying to ask AI if there was a way of doing something, and it kept hallucinating, saying that there was, until I kind of backed it against the wall and said, look, either show me documentation that this exists, or admit that it doesn't exist. And it eventually admitted that it didn't exist. So, all you got to do is, provoke it a little bit, and you may actually get the response you're looking for. But ultimately, we're getting in a direction there. I hope to finish that up really soon and kind of share that on the internet once it's done. But that is not the topic for today. The topic for today is how many components. All right. Now, what is that really talking about? What we're going to be talking about is this concept of metrics. And metrics are really important when we are trying to justify our existence in the jobs that we have in this industry. So we want to make sure that we have some kind of goalpost or otherwise definition of what it means to succeed in the work that we're doing, right? And design systems is a lot of work, and we all kind of know that. But when we have to show this kind of thing to people that are higher up and stakeholders and things of that nature, we need to justify their existence by showing them, results. And these folks really like numbers, right? So one of the things that we've done for a long time in the community and in the practice is attempted to quantify how many components any particular page or feature or application has that are of our responsibility, the design system's responsibility, right? Because you can imagine that the more components that are on a particular page, the more use the design system's getting, and then the more responsibility that we have to then do more and more things, right? But I'm going to argue today that that is, whatever number that you created, that is probably very, very fuzzy. And I don't like fuzzy numbers, all right? And the reason that I'm explaining why, or I'm going to state it's fuzzy, is because I'm pretty confident that we don't have a real good understanding of what a component actually is. Because if we did, then we'd be able to measure how many of them there are, right? So as an example, if I, for argument's sake, said that an inch was the length between my two shoulders, right? Well, you admittedly already know that, like, oh, that's not what an inch is, right? That's too large, right? But if I tell you that that's what I think an inch is, that's like the way that I'm defining it, right? And I start measuring things by that unit of measure, right? I'm going to have some different number of units of length than another person who's using the traditional inch, right? So you're going to get a different value out of both of those exercises because the way that you measure isn't well defined, right? So it's the same case when it comes to components, right? So when we look at any particular component, we say, oh, well, that's a component, but what's the qualifications of a component? And admittedly, that sort of rabbit hole, that is very much a rabbit hole, was going to be the research, kind of study that I was going to do after Mise en Mode. But admittedly, Mise en Mode did a really good job of getting popular, so I've been doing a lot of focus on that instead. But I wanted to take some time today to kind of go over a little bit of my thinking about why I think, as it is today, counting the number of components and trying to figure out how much coverage any particular page is going to have is kind of not helpful right now, okay? But to start off that, what we're going to try to do today is we're going to talk to AI today and see if they have anything to say about how we count components. So let's give this a shot and see if it works today. Hey, I got a question for you. If I had a button that had an icon and a label inside of the button, how many components would you call that from a design system perspective?
In a design system, if you have a button with an icon and text inside it, it would typically be considered as one component. The button itself would be the main component, with the icon and text being its child components or elements.
Okay. Is there any other way of us considering how many components there are, right? Because the way I've heard of it elsewhere is that a button itself is one component, and then the icon that appears in the component could just be a variant of that button instead of a component itself, or even the text label being a component or not a component, or even the wrapper for the button being its own separate component. So have you considered any of those ways of counting these components?
Oh, I see. That's an interesting perspective. Yes, there is definitely room for different interpretations on how to count components in a design system. Some designers might consider the icon and text as separate components, while others might see them as variants of the button component. And yes, the wrapper for the button could also be considered a separate component. It really depends on how the system is designed and organized. Do you have a preference on how to count these components?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about here, right? We're going to
In
stop
my
talking to
opinion,
AI
it's
for a sec.
best to make sure to document and define these components clearly within the design system so that everyone working with it understands the structure and how to use or create components within the system. Also, it's important to consider that a component may have different states such as hover, focus, etc. that should be accounted for. What do you think?
Okay. I appreciate the question there, but I want to get back on topic of what we're talking about, which is counting components. I wasn't expecting that. But hover and focus and stuff like that, those are, of course, states of components, and those would be a separate topic, I believe. And we could talk about that in some, maybe future in terms of, the different kinds of, I guess, variations of this stuff. But overall, the thing I really wanted to talk about again today is looking at a component in its default state and saying how many components is there, right? Is it just one? Is it two, three, four, right? There was some really good, interesting ideas about how that might go down from the AI. So I want to give you a little bit of my perspective in there. But in order to do that, I want to actually show you a visual of what I'm talking about. All right, so let's go to the computer for a second. Let's see here. I need to move this over here. We'll go down here. All right. So this is from a presentation that I did. I think it was last year at Smashing. Not it was at the conference necessarily. It was the pre-party or the pre-meetup before the conference that was by Smashing at Figma actually. And they asked me to do a lightning talk, so I did. And this is a talk that I actually did at UXDX earlier that year, which is less of a talk and more of a conversation. But because I can't really have a conversation with anyone right here other than the AI, we're going to have a quick, kind of discussion about what I'm showing here. And this was meant to just show that I had 10 minutes to speak. But the real important thing to notice is the button itself that I have here. And I could even hit the button here, which should, start the timer. And what I asked the group is I said exactly how I asked the AI, how many components do you see in this red region here, right? Would you call the red region a component? Would you call what parts would you call components, right? If I was to count this, how many components is there, okay? And in both of those cases, we had a good discussion overall amongst us in the group about counting components, right? Because, like I said to the AI earlier, I said, you know, what about if the container, this red region here, is a component, and then separately you add an icon component into it, you add a text label component into it, right? And then those are three components that are now potentially, depending on the way that you define these things, creating an entirely new fourth component, okay? Now, it's entirely possible that you're thinking about this and saying, well, hold on a second. The button is always supposed to have one of the two of these things, right? Either the icon or the text. So maybe there's just an area for content, and that content can either be an icon or be text, right? So in that case, then, you know, maybe it's just the container that is the component, and then you could either accept an icon or text inside, and even some people might even consider text as not being a component, right? But you could see all the different variations that could happen in here. So when we're looking at such a small thing like a button, that, and having all the different variations of that, that opens up a Pandora's box, or I'm going to call it a Pandora's card, of different ways of slicing and dicing a card or a group of cards or a table or an entire user experience. So that's the difficulty there, because when you start trying to pin down how many components there are, right? Let's, for argument's sake, say, okay, sure, the button is only one component, right? Regardless of what kind of composition you put inside, it's always one component. Fine, right? Well, if you put that button into a card, and that card is a component, it's a shared resource amongst people in the platform and the organization, right? Well, how many components are you counting then? Are you counting the card and only the card? Or are you counting the card and the button, right? Because it's not very simple then, because imagine if you had a design system that provides the Chrome for an application. Well, then everything that goes in the Chrome, that's part of the Chrome, and therefore there's only one component. But that doesn't make any sense, right? There's definitely multiple things being used and imported, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the ways that I've seen this being handled, so to speak, is actually by dependencies, okay? This is still not like 100% foolproof, but as we like to agree, the source of truth for design systems and just regularly for resources that users are going to see is code. And we could see dependencies when we are building our user interfaces, and those dependencies are typically some sort of reusable piece of code, right? Either a function, component, some other utility, something of that nature. And when we think about it as dependencies, we could create what is effectively a dependency graph. It's a tree of nodes that you could see all the ways that these things are connected. And if we were to visualize a part of the UI or even a larger experience that way, then we could start identifying, where did this node come from? Who's responsible for this particular node, right? And I think that's one of the closer ways of trying to measure how many components there are. But it's really, instead of saying components, it's really more so how many resources are dedicated to the design system or are responsible by the team who handles the design system, and how many aren't, right? Because if you think about it this way, then it's a lot closer to being black and white. But there's a little bit of a catch here, right? Because the catch here ends up being that we're not really talking about components very strictly anymore. We are really just talking about resources or packages or those kinds of publishable, resources that people can reuse, right? Because it's entirely possible, as an example, if you have some sort of, utility package or utility class project, right, that doesn't necessarily provide any functions, right, itself, then is that something you include in the dependencies? I mean, I guess you do, but it's also entirely possible you don't use any of those classes, right? Or you use one of those classes. How do you know what the usage is of there, right? Like, that's a whole different problem when your dependencies that you're bringing in aren't all the same, right? In the system that I use, the playground that I built, I made it very rigid such that I can potentially count dependencies and count components very specifically. That's because when you use the components in my library, they are encapsulated. You don't need any additional, or you're not supposed to use any additional CSS in order to compose a user interface. And that means that the composition in which you create that user interface, whether the component itself is composed or you're using some, other, primitives that are being put together, you could actually end up with an entire graph that says, okay, here are all the components, because the system doesn't offer anything else. So it's very clear about what's part of the design system and what's not. Right? But in, I guess, the real world, where things are a lot less strict and a lot more fluid when it comes to the approaches that we might take and the overrides that might happen and the miscommunications that will occur, right? Trying to get a accurate number about how many components, specifically components, that are provided by the design system are a part of an experience, it's very challenging, right? I mean, another example here, right? Again, let's go back to the card and the design system component button that's inside of that card, right? Well, what happens if there's a component that's not part of the design system but is part of the card, right? So some sort of, let's call it, maybe there's a percentage component in there, right? It shows a percentage maybe graphically, and that goes inside of the card. It's not part of the design system, but the card is. So again, how do you count that, right? Well, okay, maybe I count the card and I count the button, but then I'd have to skip the percentage component. But what happens if the percentage component uses a text component that is part of the design system, right? So you have to kind of, unfortunately, pick and choose a little bit about how you are counting what pieces are part of the system and what aren't, okay? Now, in reality, and I'm coming up on time on my screen over here, but we're not counting the time on the screen. In fact, let's just stop that right now. Okay. In reality, right, are the folks that are stakeholders out there really diving in to how a number is getting put on their desk? The answer in the majority is no, right? The folks that are in these high-level positions, they just want to see the numbers, right? And as long as the numbers are trending in a good direction, there's usually not a lot of questions about it. I mean, not to go into politics so much, but I just saw in the news about how the number of jobs in the U.S. Was, on some sort of trajectory, and then all of a sudden it was recalculated and it looks a lot worse, right? And then all of a sudden then the president's like, oh, we got to do something about this or address this or, dive into this as a problem because it looks different from what they were expecting. It's the exact same kind of thing here, right? If you provide some metrics, some numbers that are trending in a direction that no one bats an eyelash on, then that's all good. But for me personally, it's just something that's part of my nature that I want to have the reasoning to back up those numbers, right? It's the same kind of feeling that I had when I was, thinking about mise en mode and doing the exploration on mise en mode. I wanted to learn and understand why we make the decisions that we make when it comes to providing expressions. It's the exact same kind of thing from here, right? Because when we look at a component, we have a general understanding of like, okay, that's a component. Oh, well, okay, well, maybe that's a pattern. And by the way, my definition of those two different things is actually very slim in terms of a difference, where a pattern is something that isn't a published, reusable, packaged resource. I don't necessarily mean that from a code standpoint. I mean that from I'm not taking these things from like a copy and paste standpoint, where I'm like, okay, there's a pattern that's on a page and I can go ahead and redo that pattern myself, or as a component that's a packaged unit that I could just install and it starts working immediately, right? In a pattern kind of scenario, I need to do some work in order to recreate that thing. It's almost like the difference between you picking up IKEA furniture and you picking up a desk from some other place, some furniture store, right? The desk from the furniture store, that's a component, right? Because it's just one piece, you take it home and you put it in your room and you're done. But a pattern is more like the instruction books that you would get from IKEA, right? It's not the physical stuff, the physical pieces, right? Because those are technically components too, right? But you put those components together in a pattern to create another component, which would be the desk from IKEA, right? So the pattern is actually like the documentation that says this is the steps that you take in which you could make your own component or some other, experience, right? So that's the difference for me, is that a pattern could absolutely become a component. You just have to put the work in to make it a component. And it's entirely possible the component is not a reshareable resource, right? A component could be a one-off. It doesn't have to be in the design system. But I think there's a lot of, discussion, argument that could happen in there in terms of definitions, especially when it comes to, what context that particular person is talking about, right? Design systems is a multi-context place and practice, right? Where you have people who are working strictly in engineering, people who are working strictly in design, people who are working strictly in accessibility and in content, and localization, performance, all these different facets that have their own way of thinking about what a pattern and component could be. And that's, again, why that would make it really, really hard to pin down what a component is, right? Because it's all different people working in different contexts, and I think they just go across all those things very difficultly. But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Make sure you play nice in there. In terms of stuff that's going on this week, I don't really have a lot in terms of things to update you about. Yeah, there's nothing happening in New York, as far as I know, in terms of events and things that are happening. And in fact, Ben Callahan, I think, is taking off this week for the questions, so nothing to talk about there. I remember seeing that in the email. And then in terms of jobs, I haven't been looking at jobs. Just been working on Delta Zeus. Again, like I said, I'm looking forward to letting you folks know what that looks like eventually. I do have some other additional news. Now I'm thinking about it. I did finally lock down an editor. I put in a deposit for us to work together, which actually reminds me, I need to actually decline the contract that was sent to me by a publisher. But in talking with that editor, he was mentioning that it looks like I'm actually farther away to a finished book than I initially realized. So we're actually looking good. So what did he say specifically? Oh, I'm not so far off from a finished book than I thought I was. So he actually believes that there could be a finished book by October. Before you get excited about that, there's no way the book is going to be ready for October. And that's very much specifically because of Converge that's going to be happening in October, where I'm going to be speaking, and I don't have the content ready for that yet. I do know what I'm speaking about, but again, I don't have the content for that yet. So what I'm going to be doing with the book is I'm going to be working with that editor in between preparing for the content for Converge. And also in that meantime, I asked my wife, who was a publishing designer, to help me with the cover and some of the typesetting stuff as well. So I've delegated some work out, which is usually not what I do, but hopefully we'll have something. And the goal right now is Q1 next year, hopefully in time for refreshing of education budgets and things of that nature. So that's the plan right now. Maybe I've said that already, maybe I haven't. But I know I did speak to the editor just this weekend, so you didn't know about that. That's new. So anyway, really excited about that. But that's all the news I think I have for today. Again, we're going to do some more shows this week just to go ahead and get out the bugs. I think this is the week. This is the week where we're going to get a good, solid show out of it. I have it in my bones. I can feel it. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you're looking forward to it too. All right. There'll be a real sign-off eventually. I haven't figured that out part yet either. But it was great to have you. Thanks for joining, and you'll see you in the next one. Bye.